Coronavirus outbreak has brought the world economy to its knees. Several developing countries, including Rwanda, were granted credit to respond to emergency medical and other relief efforts. The IMF in March approved 109.4 million US dollars credit to Rwanda. Meanwhile, yesterday, the US President Donald Trump said that he's going to halt funding to the World Health Organization, accusing the UN agency for failing in its basic duties of responding to the coronavirus. Joining us is Andrew Mould, the head of regional integration at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us.
You're most welcome. Good evening.
Good evening. Now, let's start it off with looking at the extent of this pandemic. How bad is it to the developing countries like Rwanda?
Well, it's obviously very serious indeed. I mean, it's quite unprecedented, the scale of the economic shock that's happened to the global economy. The IMF yesterday came out with some new forecasts for the region, and it was quite interesting to see, the developments there. For Africa as a whole, they're estimating actually a decline of GDP, which hasn't happened in many decades. For the whole of the continent. East Africa is spared some of the worst of the consequences, according to the IMF's figure. So in the case of Rwanda, for example, we have GDP growth going down from around 10% to, according to the IMF, around 3.5%, which is still in positive territory, but clearly is not welcome, given the ambitious goals of the country. I think East Africa has some peculiarities, which means the impact of the crisis might be somewhat different from other parts of the continent and indeed other parts of the world. We have a relatively low rate of urbanization in East Africa. Mm-hmm. And I think rural areas are probably going to be less impacted than urban areas. The real challenge there is providing livelihood support for people in urban areas across the region. Mm-hmm. I also think East Africa is in a slightly different situation because the majority of countries actually are net commodity importers. So we've seen really dramatic declines in commodity prices, which will impact on exports, of course. But at the same time, it will also reduce import bills. I think the key challenge going forward is the drying up of foreign exchange sources. So for a country like Rwanda, which has been quite dependent on service sector income and particularly linked to the tourism industry and conferences and Rwanda Air activities, for example, those sources of income have currently dried up. Now we don't know how long this crisis is going to prolong itself, but clearly that's of some concern, isn't it?
So we've seen also several African countries, including Rwanda, acquiring IMF funds for economic recovery following the coronavirus outbreak. Do you think this is the right thing to do for developing countries?
Well, effectively, just as I mentioned now, the fact that countries have these short-term problems in terms of lack of hard currency is very welcome that the IMF steps in this way. But going forward, I think there's going to need to be more support. It all really depends on how long the crisis prolongs itself, how long it takes us to get back to a more normal situation. I think some countries may have to reassess their longer-term development strategies and the emphasis they're placed going forward. So, for example, if the global tourism industry was not to recover to the levels that we saw previously, then that might require a different strategy for countries like Tanzania, Kenya, and Rwanda, which actually have a very important tourist sector.
So let me ask, what should developing countries, like you mentioned it briefly, but what should they do to recover from this economic setback?
Well, there's challenges on a lot of fronts, isn't there? There's one side, there may be the health challenges, although in some senses, because East African countries tend to have a younger demographic, and it does seem from the medical evidence that younger people tend to be less impacted directly by the coronavirus. But there are these major health challenges on the one hand. There's a lot of additional expenditures, and there's currently a lack of income coming. So fiscal income will be reduced. That will put some governments under some pressure in terms of fiscal adjustment and the lack of foreign exchange, which I alluded to earlier. I think going forward, countries have to think more deeply about how they're going to cooperate within the realms of regional cooperation, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the like, and move those forward. Because we've seen a major disruption to global trade and global value chains. And that really hit some countries in our region quite hard. So, for example, Kenya's horticultural exports to Europe, have been completely disrupted by this lockdown of activity that we've seen in Europe. So I think going forward, we really have to, give a bigger boost to the regional agenda, regionalist incentive. The African Continental Free Trade is a key part of that. So.
Before I let you go, Andrew, yesterday we saw President Trump of the US saying that they will halt their support to the World Health Organization. What does this mean for poor countries whose response to this coronavirus outbreak has largely depended on the interventions of the World Health Organization?
Well, it's certainly a regrettable development, isn't it? I would hope that going forward, other countries may step into the gap there and help the World Health Organization by increasing their own contributions. It's an essential organization at the current juncture with the scale of the crisis that we have. Maybe going forward also, the United States may reconsider its decision. The budgetary cycle for these things is quite long, actually. And the United States, my understanding, is already $200 million in arrears with its committee contribution. So perhaps there might be some adjustment and a change of heart on the US part. But in the meantime, I think other donors would need to help support activities, particularly across developing countries. As you say, for developing countries, the health sector really needs the support of international organizations like WHO.
Andrew Mould, Head of Regional Integration for United Nations Economic Commission for Africa at East African Office.